So what we'd like to do now, unfortunately, due to weather conditions, we had a speaker from Washington, D.C. who got held up in Denver and couldn't make it. So she's going to be on the video screen. Eric, give me a thumbs up if you're ready anytime. Okay, so you've met her before. Her name is Patty Lovera. And I've worked with Patty, RCAF has worked with Patty for many years on country of origin labeling, on the Packers and Stockyards Act rules, on various issues affecting cattle producers. And Patty is the policy advisor for the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment, which is a coalition of state and national groups. Previously, Patty served as the policy director for the Organic Farmers Association and served as the Food and Water Watch program director at Food and Water Watch for 14 years, which is where we first began working together. Patty has a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Lehigh University and a master's degree in environmental policy from the University of Michigan. Before joining Food and Water Watch, Patty was the deputy director of the Energy and Environment program at Public Citizen and a researcher at the Citizen for Health, Environment, and Justice. And Patty has been a colleague and a fighter and a very effective and aggressive fighter for mandatory country of origin labeling, among others. So with that, Patty, if you're on, please welcome.
Great. Can you hear me? Are we good? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Okay, so hey everybody, I'm very sorry not to be there. I did try. I left DC yesterday. I got as far as Denver. Airline consolidation meant there were not a lot of options for getting on flights after a bunch of flights were canceled last night. So I bailed out and I'm at a friend's house near Boulder, so I could find somewhere quieter to be on a Zoom with you all before I try to get home. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that we're pushing hard for in the federal policy arena, and we're really grateful to be able to do it by joining forces with RCAF and with all of you, because we think we're long overdue for some of these fixes. So the two, and I hope, and I apologize if I'm repeating stuff that people have said already, since I couldn't get there to hear the other speakers. So the two areas I'm going to focus on are rulemaking to try to move forward how we enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act and mandatory country of origin labeling. So really fast, I'll just talk a little bit about kind of who I work with and what brings us together, and then why it's so useful to join forces with RCAF. So the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment is made up of 6 groups. I won't name all of them, but there's a couple of national groups and there's some state-based groups from the Midwest, including Dakota Rural Action from South Dakota. And they have independent livestock producer membership, and they have a lot of folks who used to be, especially in places where there used to be a much more vital independent hog producing sector, like Iowa and Missouri and places like that. And so our folks are keenly aware not only of chickenization, and we try to be in good coalition with folks who are worried about the way chicken companies conduct themselves, because that model moves. And so we've seen that model, not explicitly, not one for one, not every tactic that they use in chickens, but we've seen much more integrated, much more corporate control, pretty much a loss of the opportunity for independent hog producers to access cash markets in most of the country. So we have a lot of folks in the Midwest who are keenly aware of that. And then they are also in places where there are still independent cattle producers. And so they're really trying to find ways. We talk a lot about how do we raise that alarm, that what happened in the 90s to the hog sector seems to be happening, maybe in more slower motion, but it's happening in cattle too. And then we have to be in solidarity with folks who are in these chicken markets, because that's the model they're trying to bring to everybody. And it's, often the same companies at this point. So we have a lot of things that all the groups work on, but 2 that really put us in great alignment with RCAF, and it's so nice to work with RCAF, are, can we enforce the laws we already have in the books, like the Packers and Stockyards Act, to deal with these unbalanced relationships between these very large packers and folks who are bringing animals to market? And the incredible common sense improvement that would make the market more transparent and help people on both ends of the food chain, which is mandatory country of origin labeling. So I'll do the Packers and Stockyards Act stuff first, and then I'll move to cool. And then I'm trying to leave some time for questions, because I'm sure people have ideas and questions about where we are. So I suspect you've heard a bunch already today about the Packers and Stockyards Act, right? It's an oldie but a goodie. It's been around for a while. We need to use it better to protect folks who are bringing livestock to the market. And so one of the initiatives that's been going on for really a generation at this point is really trying to force the issue of why there hasn't been as much enforcement by the government, or when individual growers bring a complaint in the courts, which they can do under the Packers and Stockyards Act, they've hit a ceiling. And Michael just mentioned one piece of that, which is this mistaken assumption that's showing up in some courts, not all, that there's a barrier, that there's a standard that growers have to prove, that the law doesn't say they have to prove that everyone has been hurt, not just them. So this idea that you have to show injury to the whole sector, not just injury to you that was done by a packer. So we've had this frustration for a long time now, and it's taken different forms of like, how do we get around this obstacle? And many of you have been involved in this. So the short version is, through several cycles of farm bills, we got to 2008, and the 2008 Farm Bill had instructions for the USDA to update their rules about how they think about and how they enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act. So, and then in 2010, there were these big hearings that the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Justice did together. I'm sure some of you went to the one in Colorado that was about livestock markets. We got proposed rules written from that process. There was a batch of them. There were different moving parts in a package of proposed rules, but the meat industry they weren't happy that they lost in 2008 and that these rules started, and they continued to go back to Congress and use their influence to try to stop that process. And so for several years in a row, they used a different process called appropriations, which happens every year. Congress gives money to federal agencies to operate, and shenanigans can ensue in that process. And they did when it comes to this rulemaking. So for several years in a row, USDA was not allowed to finish these rules. The annual bill that gave them their budget to operate said, you won't work on this, this, and this. And it listed these Packers and Stockyards Act rules. The whole time, a big coalition of us, lots of groups, tried to undo that. We finally did, and they got through. We got through that obstacle in 2016, but it was very late in the process of changing to a new administration. And when the Trump administration came in, this was not on their to-do list, to be frank. So we are trying again in the current administration, and we have seen some progress. So I'm just going to quickly run through, and I'm sure Andy talked about this yesterday. Andy Green has been kind of leading that process. So the key thing to think about with these rules is a lot of it is spelling out kind of the important words in the Packers and Stockyards Act, so that when people want to file a complaint individually, or the government sees something that they think they can enforce on, that it's clear what these terms look like in our system now. So things like really laying out, what does it look like for something to be an undue preference? What does it look like for something to be unjustly discriminatory, deceptive, or retaliatory? So that's what a lot of the moving parts of these rules are. So there's 4 in play. 2 of them have gotten across the finish line, and 2 are still being worked on. So the first one is specific to broiler chicken contracts and the tournament payment system, which I suspect you've heard about. So I'll just summarize by saying that first one, which is final, so it is in effect, that it basically requires transparency. So at key points in the process, when somebody's going to sign up to be a new contract grower, later on, once they have, and when there's settlements and they're getting paid, that there's more disclosure about real numbers, not just like rosy scenarios, which is what has been happening to a lot of folks. And then they find themselves trapped in a system that requires a lot of debt to begin. So that's the first one. The second one is also final. It has crossed the finish line, and we've reached the effective date, and it has a very grandiose title, Inclusive Competition and market integrity under the Packers and Stockyards Act. This applies more broadly, and it defines some of those terms. What does it mean for something that a packer or a poultry buyer, poultry dealer, to what kind of actions would be discriminatory, deceptive, or retaliatory? And it defines things that you cannot retaliate against a farmer or a grower because they communicated with the government. And that has happened, especially with contract poultry growers. We've heard a lot about this, by who they associate with because they're a RCAF member, or they join a contract poultry growers association because they join a co-op, something like that. So it gets much more explicit and really spells out what the law says is not allowed. So those are the two that are finished. And then we have two that are in the works that they have more steps to go before they're across the finish line. So one is out now. We've seen it. There's a comment period happening right now, and it goes deeper on those processes that are used in the poultry industry, especially how they get paid in those tournament systems where people are grouped together and then ranked. So the proposal that's out right now for comment basically says, a group of people are put together, they're ranked against each other. And right now, some folks are paid a premium, but that premium comes because the rest of the folks are deducted. So this would create a base, and you could only have premiums above that base and some other conditions on that. It talks a lot about, are there circumstances where you shouldn't be ranking somebody in a group? Their birds were picked up late. They got sick birds. They didn't get feed on time. Are there circumstances that should take you out of one of those tournaments and put you in a different payment calculation? And additional requirements about one of the key factors in this system in chicken is a lot of pressure to kind of continually be upgrading your facilities, which for most people means more borrowing, right? A bigger loan to pay for the new water system, the new fans, whatever it is. So this has some disclosure about if they are saying that they are acquiring new investments to keep your contract, a lot more detail about what's the payout rate. Is it really required? Like just a lot more detail so people can figure that out. So that's the third one. We're looking at it now. It's open for comment now. And the fourth one, we don't get that much advance notice, but I think all signs indicate that we should be seeing it soon. And this is a big one for us because this will hopefully give us some new tools to work with to define what an undue preference is. So in a transaction where a packer is going out and acquiring livestock to process, are they showing undue preferences to some sellers over others? This is really where the rubber meets the road for a lot of folks, in cattle markets. And so we're hoping as we watch this, we can't see it. We know it exists. We're watching it move through the system. We don't know what the words say, but we can see it moving close to the point where it'll be released. And then there will be a comment period. So that's something to stay in touch with RCAF about, so we can look at it, we can see what we think, and we can put really good comments in there so it gets better as it moves through the rest of the process. So that's where we are with USDA working on this. The other thing that we always have to be aware of, though, is that the meat industry is not taking this lying down this time either, or the chicken industry. And so they have gone back to their favorite tactic of trying to stop USDA's work, right? They get to comment on these just like us. They put plenty of comments in. We've looked. They've had just the same shots that we have to influence this process, but they go further and they try to stop the process. So once again, the government runs on a funny clock, but for the last fiscal year, they tried to have a measure in the bill that said USDA will stop working. They won't finish these rules. We beat that back. So USDA is still busy working, but they're trying it again. And summer is a very important time for that process. So we are hard at work again, trying to make sure that we don't have, they're called riders, that we don't have a rider in the bill for USDA for next year, which starts in October. So that would stop work on these rules because we need them finished. It's been far too long. And the meat industry has had plenty of chances to influence this process, just the way the rest of us have, and they can live with it. They shouldn't get to stop the process and just continue business as usual because they don't want USDA to modernize how they think. Right. So that's something that we're always on the lookout for. We're always working on. And we will, at crucial times in the process, reach out through Bill to find people who can make a call or talk to their member of Congress and convey that this is not acceptable. The USDA's process needs to be finished. They're working through a public process to get all kinds of input and update how they think about enforcing law. That's it. All of the whining, all of the rhetoric from the industry is really not real. And we need to just communicate that as often and as loudly as possible to Congress so that USDA can finish this up. So that's Packers and Stockyards. I'm going to shift to country of origin labeling. I know I got plenty of folks who are veterans of this fight in the room. So I think I went to my first meeting about country of origin labeling, which seemed logical. Why don't we have it? I think it was 2002. And here we are, still working on it because it's still a good idea that would help help the market function better, because it would be more transparent. People would know what's happening and they could make choices accordingly, right? It's pretty obvious to all of us. So just in case it hasn't come up, but I suspect it has, right? So we talked about country of origin labeling in the 2002 Farm Bill, did it again in the 2008 Farm Bill, finally got mandatory country of origin labeling for a bunch of foods, including beef, across the finish line. Then took a while to get USDA to do it. We had it for a while. And then again, large meat packers never won to accept reality gracefully. They tried to stop it in the US courts. That didn't work. They tried to pressure USDA into just not finishing the rules. That didn't work. So then they convinced Canada and Mexico to go to the World Trade Organization to challenge our US law. The World Trade Organization is a whole thing that is a very, unaccountable venue where corporations use countries to just wipe out regulations they don't like. And that process went apace, and then it kind of created a crisis, came back to Congress, and Congress repealed the mandatory country of origin labeling for meat in 2015, despite the fact that they had other options of negotiating and possibly modifying our law to deal with the complaints. Instead, they just repealed it, and we've been pushing ever since to get it back. So people, I don't know if this has come up, I apologize if I'm repeating, just to be super clear, because there's different things happening in different arenas. We have seen some progress at the USDA in closing a loophole in the definition of what a product of the US is, and that's great. It's a dumb loophole. It should be closed. Product of US should mean born, raised, and slaughtered here. End of story. It shouldn't have taken this long, but the USDA is working to close a loophole that if something says product of the US, that's the standard. That's great. The issue is that is a standard for voluntary labeling. It is not a requirement that you have to label. And that's the end goal for us. We want mandatory labeling, which we had for a while before the repeal in 2015. So great that the loophole is getting fixed, that the voluntary labeling will be more accurate. That is appropriate. It should have happened a long time ago, but we aren't done yet. We have to get mandatory back, and that comes from Congress. So it is, for the second year in a row, a Farm Bill year. Didn't get it done last year. We're working on it still. So that is the most likely arena where we can do something like restoring the requirement for mandatory country of origin labeling for beef. So there are, I'm not sure if Representative Hageman made it. I heard she had travel trouble too. If she made it, she probably talked about it. She has a bill that would restore mandatory country of origin labeling. There's a comparable bill in the Senate, the American Beef Labeling Act, that would bring back mandatory country of origin labeling. And those, we are in a moment right now where it's super important. If you have any communications as they come home for the summer break with members of Congress, that is very, very clear, right? That there should be no farm bill that doesn't have mandatory cool in it. We have wasted enough time. Congress can fix this. There are existing bills they can just put in to the farm bill that they're developing in either the House or the Senate. So we can talk about, I mean, we've run into every excuse in the book. People can ask a question at the end if they want to talk a little bit about the WTO excuse. It's a favorite. It's very annoying, quite frankly, to hear members of Congress just act like they work for the WTO. when their job as members of Congress is to make the laws for this country. And yet when this issue comes up, suddenly the WTO tells them what to do, and we're not allowed to have this. So we can talk about that. We need to be pushing back really firmly against that, because that is not the case. We have plenty of other options to negotiate with our trading partners to get mandatory cool back. And so that we have materials, we've been doing some webinars and things like that. We're happy to share that with anybody so that we can kind of take that excuse away and really push really hard. Eventually this fall, maybe when there's a farm bill, that we can get mandatory cool back in it. Yeah, so those are kind of the big updates that we're dealing with. I think I'm happy to shift to questions if people have it, but I will just kind of wrap up my part by saying, right now we're in kind of on these two issues, it's kind of a critical time in two different arenas of stuff that we track in DC. So in this process of trying to get these rules done for the Packers and Stockyards Act to be enforced more rigorously, we need Congress to stay out of it, quite frankly. I mean, it's actually their one skill, is not getting things done, right? So they could just not mess with this process and not put one of these riders in the appropriations bill for USDA for next year. So we actually have kind of a group letter that we use through this process. So if anybody has a local or state association you want to sign your business on, we will happily add you to kind of show the breadth of the coalition that wants these rules to proceed and just let the process work out. So Bill, I can hook you up with that letter. I'm happy to resend it, but we would love to get groups representing livestock producers, more of them on this letter that we will use through the process, saying do not stop these rules from getting across the finish line. And then on country of origin labeling, we're entering the summer season where your members of Congress are going to be home more. They're going to be out and about. If you see them, talk about cool and talk about, yes, the Farm Bill needs to do lots of things. It's a big, complicated package. There's other stuff that has to happen, but it is past time for mandatory cool to be restored in this market, for all of the reasons you all know very, very well. That's it. That's the demand for the Farm Bill, is put mandatory cool back in it. So there are ways to do that. If you see a member of the Senate out and about, they could communicate with Senator Round's office. He's working on a letter to that effect, saying we need cool in the Farm Bill, so they could join that letter. Or you could just call him up. And if you got a pen handy, you could write down the number. The number's 202-224-3121. And if you have a break, you could call them during the break. That's the switchboard. You tell them where you live. They'll send you to the right offices, and you could leave a message and say, as you work on the Farm Bill, we need country of origin labeling back. That's how we bother them to the point where they start to listen. So yeah, I'll stop there. Bill, I can do some questions. I can talk about other Farm Bill stuff if people have questions about, other competition things that might show up, but you let me know what's useful.
Sure. So we'll call for questions. Anyone with questions for Patty, comments? This isn't possible.
Not on cool. I know somebody has something to say about cool.
Yeah.
Patty, Brett Kinsey, I just really appreciate your comments about getting with these people when they're home on break. It's great to go to DC. I know you're in DC, but you don't have to go to DC to make a difference. I think it might be more effective to be with your friends and neighbors and approach some of these guys. Maybe not more effective, but a good additional measure. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, and they will be home the entire month of August, a good chunk of July, and all of October, right? So you're going to see more of them than I am, and that's fine with me because we need a little break in DC. So they will be out and about, right? And so they're going to be hearing about reference prices for the commodity crops. They're going to hear about disaster payments, and that's all important stuff, but they also need to hear about cool. We just have to constantly be pecking away at them so that this makes the list.
Other questions, comments? So, yes, please, right over here. And Patty, we have a record turnout this year, 450 registered. So you're talking to a big group of cattle producers right now.
Hi, Patty. This is Penny Vance. I think we've met before, different Zoom calls. I'm wondering, this group of people are really good about calling their legislators, but sometimes they get pretty worn out because nothing seems to happen when they do. And I wonder if you would comment, since you're back in Washington, D.C., so you see what happens when a legislator gets calls or doesn't get calls or how many calls it takes. Just the value of emails and calls and what happens to them when they get to the legislator's office.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an eternal struggle, right? We're trying to cut through a lot of noise and a lot of folks coming at them on a 1,000 issues, probably actually 1,000. So kind of the hierarchy of contact, and I'm not going to turn any of it down. Like, I'm just because you can't do, the most impactful thing doesn't mean it's okay to do nothing. You do what you have time to do. There's nothing like them meeting you as a constituent and spending some time to understand, this is what my operation looks like. I'm in this community. This is my business. I employ people, et cetera, et cetera. If there is ever a chance to get any legislator, Congress, state legislator to your farm, to your operation, it can be a pain in the butt. It can be a pain in the butt logistically and to line it up, but there's nothing better because they really like getting their picture taken there, right? They're out seeing constituents who are in agriculture, and it's more real, right? They're on your place, seeing what you do, and you're saying, this is what I need. I understand that as a heavy lift, but we have seen votes change because of that kind of contact. So that's like the top of the heap. And I know that that's a big ask, but kind of working down, absolutely anything face to face with them where they are hearing from humans, which can be at, a town hall that they do, an event they go to where, depending where you're based, it's going to be state fair season. Just even a quick conversation, if they hear a couple times that night about another topic, it does register. And that doesn't mean we're automatically finished and we've won, but you're starting to crack through. So that kind of contact, face-to-face contact, is unbelievable. Letters to the editor count if the office is being run properly. They are watching the media in their state or in their district, and if people are writing in and they're seeing commentary and things like that. And then you get to kind of the mass stuff, can we make the phones in their DC office ring? So they keep, if you've ever gone, you're probably not going to talk to the senator when you call. That's pretty unlikely. But the people who are answering the phone, their job is to kind of track, they will keep sheets of, if this was a constituent and they called about this issue. And if you've ever gone and lobbied when you're waiting for your meeting, the phones are ringing. And so the more people that are calling in, just the higher on that list you show up. So, and then emails are kind of the same thing. And there's a little bit of an arms race of technology of those emails getting through. So if people have the ability to call, we tell them to call. So you're right. It feels like we're pushing something uphill, and we are, but we have seen other issues when something reaches some kind of boiling point because they are just hearing about it all the time. That's when things start to happen. So we just have to be a nuisance to them. It has to be easier to figure this out than to keep being bothered about it. And on country of origin labeling in particular, they have been a lot of members who should know better and who should be better on this issue are literally hiding behind that they think the WTO doesn't let them do something, and they should be politely pushed back on that, right? Since when does the United States let the WTO tell us what we do? It's crazy. And we have had conversations with staffers who are like, yeah, my boss doesn't think we should have the WTO, but the WTO says we can't have pool. And that shouldn't be the end of that conversation. We just have to push them a little bit to get them to reconcile those thoughts and admit that it's time for us to take another look at this.
Yeah, Perry Owens from Kansas. I was just curious on the USDA regs and stuff. I think it was our great Senator Moran that stopped the appropriations last time. How are you going to keep from having that happening again?
So, it happened a bunch of years in a row when we were doing this from 2011 to 2015 every year. And then they tried it again last year and we kept it out. So there's some mechanical stuff about who runs committees. So the guy who is running the really critical subcommittee in the House where this bill starts, he is from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Guess what's on the Eastern Shore of Maryland? A lot of chickens and a lot of chicken companies. So he put that in there. It is in the House version right now. It was in the House version last year, and we kept it out because we worked really, really hard in the Senate. And it's a much more these competition issues are a much more bipartisan issue in the Senate, and we kept it out. And also, what is different this time from 10 years ago is the world around us has changed on these issues. Like, we are better about calling out consolidation. When markets are broken, all of the supply chain stuff, we are getting help in parts of the government who are willing to talk about it that we weren't 10 years ago. So we have a fight this summer. I'm not going to lie about that. But we also had a fight last year, and we did prevail. So we're going to keep pushing very, very hard. We need your help to do that, especially when you're talking to your senators. And what it boils down to is that this is the industry trying to just take their ball and go home, and because they don't, they had their opportunity to work on these rules just like we did. And what they are objecting to is they don't want to be held to a standard that you're not allowed to be deceptive, discriminatory, or retaliatory. And if that's your business model, I have a lot of questions about that. So I think we just really need to make sure, especially our senators, understand that. And hopefully, again, this year, we can keep the process alive.
So I don't see any further questions. Patty, thank you very much. Wish you safe travels home. Sorry for the inconvenience. No other questions. So, Patty, thank you.
Okay. Thank y'all. Sorry I couldn't make it.